Hello and welcome. Welcome to this MUSE webinar, Microsoft Power BI and Data Repository. I'm Michelle Lambert, and I also have with me today Alan Sherbinin, CEO of MUSE. Alan will be running the Q&A session and closing us out of our webinar today. Before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. You're muted, you're in the listen-only mode. Now you have two options for audio. You can either use your telephone or your computer's microphone and speakers. You can switch between the two by expanding the audio tab on your GoToWebinar control panel and then selecting the audio button of the option you'd like. If you have any questions or comments during the webinar, you will need to type your questions into the question box, or you can ask your question vocally by clicking the hand icon. When you click this icon, we can then unmute you to be heard while asking your question. And if you plan on vocally asking a question and you're logged into the audio with your computer, you will need to ensure you have a working microphone or switch to the telephone option. All questions submitted will be read to our presenters by Alan at the end of the webinar. We are recording this webinar today, and it will be uploaded to the MUSE website shortly after the webinar is completed. Now I'd like to introduce you to our presenters. Please welcome Ian Crawford, Director of Communication and Training at Acmeware, Glenn DeBate, President at Acmeware, and Dan Dietrich, Manager of Data Analytics and Services at Northeastern Vermont Regional Hospital. And now I will turn it over to Ian. 1 second, sorry.
Thanks, Michelle. Still. Let's see. Michelle, I don't have the prompt yet. There it goes. Thank you. I know you're waiting for GoToMeeting to make up its mind. Give me 1 second. We're going to show this guy. Okay. Bingo. Everyone sees that? Title slide?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, good. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thanks to Alan, Michelle, and Alicia at MUSE for hosting us today. Dan and Glenn and I are excited to tell you a little bit about Microsoft Power BI. But before we get started, I do have a quick question just for Alan. Alan, do you know what you call a dinosaur with an extensive vocabulary?
What do you call a dinosaur with an extensive vocabulary?
A thesaurus. Okay, sorry about that, everybody. Did you really not know? Did you really not know that one, Alan? I'm surprised.
On the inside.
All right, sorry everyone. That's a nod to the fact that we didn't have an Inspire conference this year and get to hear some of Alan's great jokes. So I did my best, Alan. I can never hold a candle to you though. My apologies to everyone else in the audience. Here's a look at our agenda for today, which should only take us for the formal part of the presentation, I'm hoping 40-45 minutes, as we want to make sure we leave plenty of time at the end of our session for questions. First, I'll tell you about what Microsoft Power BI is and what applications and services are part of the platform. I'll hand it over to Glenn, who will then talk specifically about how you can leverage Power BI with MEDITECH Data Repository. And we'll finish with Dan demonstrating some of the really cool reports and dashboards that he and his team at Northeastern Vermont have built and already have in production with Power BI. So what exactly is Power BI? If we were at a MUSE conference or another session in person today, I would do a survey of the room and ask you to, with a show of hands, to show me how many of you already know what Power BI is, may already be using it, or at least may have heard of it, at least from Microsoft. But for those of you that haven't heard of it or haven't used it before, this slide from Microsoft kind of says it all. This is right from their website, including a link to their documentation that you can read and get more information about it. But in short, Power BI is an analytics platform, or informatics if you prefer, that includes a combination of desktop software and cloud-based services you use to develop and share information in using reports, visualizations, and dashboards. These are all terms from Microsoft they use to describe the things in Power BI. You can share them with your audience in very dynamic and interactive ways. Power BI may seem relatively new, but in fact, it's been around for 5 or 6 years as a standalone informatics platform. We've seen it come to prominence really in the last couple of years, especially as Microsoft has embraced the cloud-based and sort of software as a service model through Office 365, now Microsoft 365, and its Azure platform. So I'll start with the three primary components from Power BI and talk about the first two, especially in a little more detail. First, there's the desktop software application called Power BI Desktop. I know it's an imaginative name. Next is the Power BI service, which is the cloud-based platform where reports live. And finally, there are also Power BI mobile apps as another option for sharing reports with your users. I don't mean to discount the last one, but we have yet to see mobile apps embraced in a hospital environment, particularly for this type of analytics. And when Dan gets to his part of the session, if you want to contradict me, please do. We haven't heard of too many sites using it at that level yet. There's more to Power BI. There's another desktop application called Power BI ReportBuilder for developing what Microsoft calls paginated reports, or those that you design to fit on a printed page. And finally, there's the Power BI Report Server, not to be confused with the service I just mentioned, that you use to host published reports within your local network versus sharing them in the cloud. So in the next few slides, I'll talk about each of these components in a little more detail. First up is our go-to application for designing reports, Power BI Desktop. And I've got us, here we go. I've got just a screenshot of that to give you a flavor for what it looks like if you haven't seen it. Now you can download Power BI Desktop for free from Microsoft. That part of the software has no cost, and it's fully functional. It's not a trial version. This application would typically be used by your IT or IS staff, maybe a power user within a department. It's really the people whose job it is to design and build a report. And here's a little more information about what we use Power BI Desktop for. But basically, it's a very powerful application that you use to connect to data from just about anywhere. So of course, that means probably first and foremost, MEDITECH Data Repository, but all types of other SQL databases, relational systems, flat files, data from cloud-based services, of course, other Microsoft data from Excel and so on. It's a very long list. And then you use desktop to connect to these different data sources to build what they call a data model, which really becomes the basis for all of your reports and dashboards, which you then design and build around these data models. And these reports, the dashboards, again, the term they use also is visualizations. It's kind of a newer way to say chart, for example, but they're very dynamic and interactive. You can also have traditional table-based data, design your report, and then ultimately you publish or share it from the desktop application out to the Power BI service. The Power BI service then, again, is the cloud-based site where you and your users interact with reports that you've shared. So it really is kind of the front door to all the reports, the dashboards, and the other Power BI components that go with those. And you'll see some examples of that in a few minutes. There is some ability from this site to modify and even create new reports, but outside the desktop application, it's not quite as robust. Let's look at a sample report from the service. So you can see I put the URL at the top of the screen here. This basically, as you can tell, again, it's in the cloud. It's purely out on the internet, the powerbi.com/homepage. And this is what you'll see that when you log in, of course, once you have an account. So you can see, let's just say an older photo of me, but you can see on the left, you've got your navigation toolbar that lets you sort of navigate to all the different apps and reports and other components. And then of course, as you do that and select a report, for example, on the right, that report will render very quickly, present the data. If you're coming from using SQL Server reporting services or other tools, perhaps, you know, when you click on a report, sometimes you have to wait for something to execute and there's sort of a delay before you see the data. Power BI behaves very differently. You click on a report and you almost instantaneously see everything that you want to see. So I found this graphic from Microsoft, and this might be especially for the more technical minded. It really kind of helps because Power BI has so many components, different pieces of software and different services. and what you use to do what can be a little bit confusing at first. So this graphic kind of nicely really shows the difference between the functions and features of the desktop application and the service, as well, of course, as where there's some overlap between them. Putting it more simply, the desktop, Power BI desktop, is where you design and develop your reports, and the Power BI service is where you share and consume them. So if we look at that concept from a workflow standpoint, at least from Microsoft's perspective, this is kind of how they visualize that, right? You build it in Power BI desktop, you design it, you connect to your data sources, you can do some custom filtering and other things there. Ultimately, you share it out on the Power BI service on the web, and then optionally also publish it to Power BI mobile apps as sort of a second place where those reports can be used by your users. So let's look at another option for developing reports, which is an application whose name I already mentioned that you may have heard of, may sound familiar, and it's called Power BI ReportBuilder. Now this is a different desktop application for designing reports, but these are referred to again as paginated or paginated if you prefer reports, as we mentioned earlier. So again, think of reports that you would format as a PDF file, possibly format to fit on a printed 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. Now, if this sounds familiar, it should be, because the software until recently was called Microsoft Report Builder, or just plain Report Builder, and has been associated with SQL Server reporting services for many years. These are the reports that have an RDL extension when you save them, just like those that you might design with various Visual Studio applications for SQL Server, like SQL Server data tools. The difference with Report Builder has always been that when you design an RDL report, you're really building one report at a time, right, before you publish it. It's a single RDL file, not a group of reports that are organized into projects like you might with Visual Studio. It's still the same format, so you're still publishing those reports, but it's just a sort of a, I don't call it a one and done tool, but it really is a one report at a time kind of approach. So that last slide, again, based on Report Builder and based on its sort of being established with SQL Server reporting services, leads us to kind of a logical question, and that is, what's up with reporting services, or SQL Server reporting services is the full name, which we always abbreviate as SSRS. So is Power BI replacing reporting services? The short answer is no. All the SSRS tools are still available, but are greatly de-emphasized by Microsoft, at least from a marketing standpoint. I kind of had to go searching quite a bit on Microsoft's website to sort of see, all right, when I started looking into Power BI, what about reporting services? Where do they sort of fit that in the context? So if you're using reporting services today, it's still a tried and true way to publish paginated reports inside your network. And really what I mean by that is servers on your local network, even if those servers are physically inside your building, or if in fact they're remotely hosted by something like CloudWave, it's still inside your network. And especially still relevant if you're using Visual Studio for other applications within your facility. So as you'll see when we get to Dan's demonstration, however, their reports in Power BI look and behave much differently than the sort of traditional SSRS reports. Perhaps, I can't say I'm speculating here, in a nod to their customers that are using reporting services, Microsoft does offer another platform for hosting both I'm going to call them traditional paginated reports, as well as the visual-based dashboards from Power BI desktop, and it's called Power BI Report Server. Everything's prefaced with Power BI, right? Now, the Power BI Report Server is similar to SQL Server reporting services, or the report manager, and the Power BI service, but in different ways. Like the Power BI service, Report Server hosts Power BI reports, that is, those you build with Power BI desktop. It also hosts the paginated reports you could build with Report Builder. Like SQL Server reporting services, the Power BI Report Server is, I say on premises, what I really mean again is inside your network, it's not cloud-based. So the Power BI Report Server features are really a superset of everything that's traditionally in SQL Server reporting services. Everything you can publish or do in reporting services, you can also publish out to Power BI Report Server. Power BI Report Server, again, has the added features of also being able to host the Power BI desktop designed reports. So it's kind of the best of both worlds from a report presentation standpoint. And it may be, but also keep in mind it's fairly expensive. The Power BI report server ability requires what Microsoft calls their premium license version, which has per capacity pricing, which is fairly expensive. Never mind, of course, it also requires dedicated server hardware too. So just keep that in mind. So for my final slide, before I hand it off to Glenn, I'll show you kind of side by side, generally speaking, sort of the development process. Again, I'm thinking of data repository reports specifically for the most part, between using these two different platforms, right? With SQL Server reporting services on the slide on the left and sort of Power BI on the right. Keep in mind, these are not mutually exclusive. It's just two different ways of doing things. So even though my slide says then and now, we're really talking about in a realistic environment, and I think Dan can also echo this, you might wind up using both. So with that, I will hand it over to Glenn.